Hi, I'm going to be talking about Escape from Tethys today. It's a game that I worked on for the last 6 months. This is going to be a bit of a postmortem. I worked on it with my partner, Jack Presnell, who's the artist for the game. He also helped design parts of it and just plan out parts of it. And he's play tested and play tested and play tested. He probably has like 80 hours played in the game. So this video is going to be a little bit rough. I'm just recording fresh. You'll be able to hear my keyboard, my mouse, and all that. I won't do a ton of editing. And I might split it out. It might be kind of long. I don't know. I do have a bit of a cold as well, so if you hear sniffles or coughs or whatever, I apologize in advance. So Escape from Tethys, again, there might be spoilers in this video, so if you haven't played it and you care, go ahead and check it out. There's not a ton of story in the game, so if you're worried about that, I wouldn't be too worried. It's more of some endgame stuff or power-up stuff or something like that. Escape from Tethys is a game that I, again, worked on for about 6 months, and I spent roughly 20 to 40 hours a week working on it. Now, I do have a full-time job, so it was essentially clock out of my full-time job, or I quote-unquote clock off, be done with work for the day, and then log on and start coding. I actually didn't have a ton of time for video games or anything like that, except for when God of War came out, and I had to play that. So I spent a bunch of time playing that for like a weekend, and when that was done, I went right back to this. Okay, so let's talk about, first of all, it just came out on Steam a couple days ago. Let's talk about how it's doing. I think it came out on Thursday in the evening. We basically released it as soon as Valve approved the final build. Since Thursday, in the first 24 hours, we did better than we expected. I told my artist that if we sold more than 20 copies, I would be really happy. And if somehow we managed to sell more than 50 copies, I would be like ecstatic. And the first 24 hours, we managed to sell more than 50 copies. Or I think it was like 48 or something like that. So I know that doesn't sound like that much, but for someone who's never actually, fully finished like a retail game, that's insane in my mind. And we didn't do it to make money, so that's why we dropped the price down to $5 instead of 10, which we were originally going to have it. And I've got to say that I'm super happy about how it's performing on Steam. At this point, we've sold just about like 70 copies or so, and it's been about 3 days actually now. And again, most people would look at that and be like, wow, you just spent the last 6 months of your life working on something that's sold 70 copies. And I agree with you. It's not the best thing ever, but keep in mind that it was also a total hobby thing. It was in my free time. I still do have a full-time job. I didn't quit my job to make this or anything like that. And the good news is that the response from playtesters and from the couple of people that have given feedback, just random customers, has been really positive. Nobody's like blown away and is like, this is the best game ever. But everyone that's played it is like, yeah, this is a solid Metroidvania. And for those who don't know, Escape from Tethys is a Metroidvania. Similar, I shouldn't even call it a Metroidvania because it's missing a lot of the Vania elements. So it's more like a Metroid-like, where you explore a giant facility, you collect power-ups, you get stronger throughout the game, and of course, by the end of the game, you play it much differently than you did at the very beginning. So yeah, again, in terms of how it's doing on Steam, it's surpassed our expectations, at least mine personally, which is great. One thing that I want to point out, let me pull up the page here. One thing that I want to point out is that it is insanely hard to get people to leave reviews. So far, only one customer has actually left a review. He said 8 out of 10 good game, which I'm totally happy with. And then the other people, I think 2 of them are playtesters that helped us during beta, who, like, we didn't coerce into writing these reviews or anything. We weren't like, write a good review or else. They gave their honest feedback. And then one person is a YouTuber who we sent a key to, who started playing it, and we watched the video. And by the way, it's really cool to watch someone play the game that you spent 6 months making on YouTube. It's just, and having fun too. At least it sounded like he was having fun. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, one more thing that I want to point out is before we released, we actually put this game up on Steam, I think in June, very early on in June. And we managed to get a ton of wish lists early on. I think right before we launched, we had about 280 or so wish lists. And the conversion rate for when the game actually launches is very, very, very small, which sucks a lot, obviously. But, you know, what are you going to do? So now the wish lists are somewhere over 400 or so. I'm not actually sure if that is... I'm not actually sure if that is something that Valve like goes back and updates in terms of the people that bought from the wish list or whatever. But anyway, now it says that we have a little bit over 400 wish lists. Okay, so moving on from Steam stuff, I want to talk about the history of the project and how it started and all that. So it originally began as a bunch of people from a forum who wanted to make a game together, and it was not meant to be like a retail game. It was like, let's do a game jam style game, 2 weeks, maybe even 1 week. And it was 4 people who joined a Discord together and were like, let's think up ideas and do something really cool. And I think it was me that suggested it, because I think everyone was kind of quiet, and I was like, let's make a Metroidvania. It's my favorite genre. And I think that we can knock something out that's really simple and easy to do in about 2 weeks. We had a designer at the time. We had 2 designers, technically. One was also a UI designer, UI UX, and a programmer. And one was a designer that actually works at a professional game company. I can't name it, but I'm 100% sure like anyone that watches this video has heard of it, most likely. But he is a contractor, so he was going to do all of the game design for us. That was his basic job. So we set out and we started working on it. I started doing prototyping for platforming stuff in Unity. I started importing all kinds of controllers, trying to play with stuff, make it feel really good to move around. And our designer started a document, which I will pull up here. Yeah, it's this one. So after about 24 hours, we actually got another message from Jack, who was like, hey, I would love to help. I'm an artist. I'm a pixel artist. And we brought him in. Before that, our designer was going to do all the art himself, but then he saw Jack's art and he was like, oh, okay, that's way better than what I can do. What's really cool is that Jack had actually only been doing this for a year, I think that he said. So since March or something like that of last year, I don't actually know for sure, so don't quote me on that. But he's relatively new and his stuff is great, like 1,000 times better than anything that I can do. And he moves really fast. So we're just like, can you draw this, and this enemy? And 20 minutes later, as long as he was online, it would be done. And then we could be like, hey, could you change the colors, or could you change the shape, or add this animation or whatever? And he was able to accommodate every single time. So that was great. And we started working on it. And then there was this kind of rift between myself and the game designer, because we were all like Metroidvania, and he was designing a Mega Man like, because he was like, there's no way we can finish a Metroidvania in 2 weeks. Let's make it way more simple. And eventually I was like, oh, okay, all right. I guess so. I'd like to include some kind of upgrades or something like that. And he was like, oh, all right. And then there was this whole thing about designing upgrades and stuff like that we talk about, and I'll get into that a little bit later when it comes to design. But eventually, I think that he finished about... I don't know if he did all of this. He might have. I think actually Jack started appending to this document right around here. Or maybe it was right around here. I don't remember. But can I actually see that? See new changes? No. Okay, whatever. So we had this document, and about 1.5 to 2 weeks in, I remember I was putting in like hours and hours and hours of work, and I had this like platformer, and I had a bunch of code written, and you could jump around, you could collect upgrades, you could shoot stuff. I remember there was a boss coded out, there was multiple enemies coded out. The main character was in, there was upgrades, and I remember looking at this document, and it was maybe 2 pages long, and I was just like, what are you doing with your time? You're like, we need to design this thing if we're going to finish in any amount of time. And at that point, I think something went off in his head or something like that, where he was like, okay, you know what? I think that I'm not up to making the kind of game that you want to make. And then he just kind of ghosted and vanished or whatever. So sucks, sort of. But at the same time, like, it helped us because it gave me and the artist, who are putting in way more time than anyone else, the freedom to continue. And this, again, this is in early January. This is like the first 2 weeks of the project. The fourth guy that I mentioned earlier, the UI UX designer and did a little bit of programming, disappeared after the first day. So he, like many other game jam people and people you meet on the internet, just kind of was like, oh, screw this, and just left. And there's nothing against the original game designer. It's just that, you know, he kind of ghosted on us, and we needed some more work done in terms of the design much more quickly than he was able to provide. So basically, at a certain point, a couple problems arose, which I'll talk about in the design section of this video. But we picked up another 2 people. We started working on the actual Metroidvania world in, I think, very early February or end of January. And very early on, it was like there was one small section where you could walk around in, different rooms that you could enter and exit. And we wanted to bring on more people to design the world. So we made another forum post. We asked for 2 more people, and we did get 2 more people. So at that point, I was deep into level designing. I was creating ridiculous amounts of area, and I can actually pull this up. This is going to be some map spoilers. So just don't look at your screen if you don't want to be spoiled, or if you do, you know, whatever. So this is the final map, and I would estimate, hopefully you can see my mouse cursor, but I would estimate that basically this tiny little section down here was done in about a week. We brought 2 more people on, and we were like, we need levels cranked out, and we need them like fast. We estimated that it takes about 10-15 minutes to do a single room, and that was like a very generous estimation, because a lot of these rooms were very simple and could be done in a matter of 5 minutes once you knew what you were doing. So we estimated that it should not take more than, you know, a week, maybe 2 weeks to do like an entire big section like this. Especially if you don't have to code anything, if you don't have to worry about making anything connect with anything, because the way that we were doing is we were modularizing it and making it so that we would design this big section, the big orange section, and the big gray section, and the big blue section, and then connect them all at the very end, and maybe fill it in with more rooms as necessary. So we, after about 2 weeks, you know, I was definitely checking in, and I was starting to get worried, because both of them were constantly, and this is over Discord, both of them constantly were kind of playing video games or doing other stuff. They were somewhat active in Discord, and we made it very clear early on that we were like, we need levels pumped out fast. We're trying to get this done as soon as possible. We had a deadline at the time. We were like, end of February, let's finish this game. So it was something like February 15th or something, and I remember I remember being like, it's time to merge all these different areas of the map into one big section, and I looked at what was done from both sides, and it was like, it was bad. It was not bad in terms of like badly designed, but there was clearly only like a couple of hours over 2 weeks done. Now, I can't expect, you know, people to be passionate about something that they didn't start, if that makes sense. They obviously joined late. They weren't involved in any of the decision making or anything like that. But at the same time, they did decide like, hey, it'd be cool. I'm cool with spending a lot of time on this. You know, this sounds good to me. We made it very clear that it would be time consuming and that we were looking for people that wouldn't just ghost. So at that point, I was kind of like, hey, look, appreciate your help. I'm actually going to scrap whatever you did, and I'm going to kind of redo everything, and you know, you can hang around Discord or whatever if you want, but now we need to push and get this done. Because them working on it any longer would have actually slowed us down, just because of the amount of work I had to do to make. I actually kept part of this blue area. Now it's almost unrecognizable, but back then I remember spending hours like redoing giant sections of it just because the enemies weren't placed right, or there were certain jumps you couldn't make, and it was just super dull. So I spent literally hours redoing that, like probably 40 hours redoing a lot of these sections. But that's neither here nor there, because it was March at that point, and we had, I think, mid-March. Did I write it down here? So we had a playable game, except for the final two bosses, somewhere around mid-March. And it wasn't even rough or anything. Like, it was fully playable. It was definitely not ready for retail release or anything like that. And we decided that it was time to re-examine what we were doing. And I think this is a common theme, but we decided to increase the scope even more. We decided on more enemies, more upgrades, more areas, more bosses, and stuff like that. And looking back on it now, I realize that we were crazy. It was almost never ending. It was a constant scope creep. I remember in January, we were like, we'll be done by the end of January. We'll be done by mid-February. We'll be done by the end of February. Okay, now we'll be done by the end of March, end of April. And I remember at the end of April talking to the artist and Jack, and he was just kind of like, you know what? I don't really care when it gets done. Let's just do the best job we can with what we have. And I was like, okay, cool. But at that point, we were actually getting closer to getting done. But so in mid-April, we opened up applications. I don't want to say applications. We made another post for playtesters, and we picked up about 20-ish playtesters. Unfortunately, this is I guess this is just the internet. Like as you saw with the game designer, with all the other people that we picked up, but all the playtesters, despite us making it very clear that we wanted like a constant loop of feedback, maybe one playtest a week, maybe even a couple playtests a week, that it wouldn't be fun, that it would be kind of workish. We offered them, a free copy of the game, a free copy for their friend, and name in the credits. They disappeared after the first day. Many of them didn't even play the game or open it. Some of them, I remember a couple of them like played it, said like that was fun, and then never showed up again. Never gave any feedback besides like, oh, that was fun. I'll play it again later. and then never showed up again. We had several playtesters that were with us a lot, and I just want to shout out to them. They're in the credits, but they helped us a ton. They found a ton of bugs, and obviously the best playtester was the artist Jack, who spent, I cannot imagine how many times he's played this game, but I'll go back to that. This is our Trello. Well, let me finish the story first. So we put it on Steam in the coming soon section in June. And then I went on vacation for about 3 weeks. And I came back and I remember fixing a bunch of bugs, and then we submitted it to Valve for approval, which took about 3 or 4 days or something like that. And then we released on Thursday last week. So that's the whole story. And I want to talk about our process of how we worked and stuff like that. Because what's interesting is that we've never actually met in person. Jack is, I think, in Thailand or something like that. And, I don't actually know entirely what he looks like. So this was what we used to communicate. This was our tasks. This was bugs and stuff like that. This has actually changed a bunch since the inception of when we started this, or that was redundant, but since the inception. All of our art for the entire game is in here. There's actually probably stuff missing because it was posted into Discord, but you can see here, like clicking open this, there's a ton of art just made for every section of the game. Like the geothermal plant has tile sets here and more tiles that were added at the bottom and tiles here and all kinds of environmental assets and backgrounds and stuff like that. And then there's enemies going way down. Like these are all the lava enemies and their sprite sheets. Actually, I don't even think it's all of them. Anyway, so very early on, this was kind of like this is what I'm working on, because largely it was based off of my schedule. Stuff had to be implemented when I was working. It was only 2 people, so it wasn't a big deal. And it was a little bit asynchronous at times because of the time difference. So I would ask for something on Discord and wake up in the morning and see that he did it and then implement it later that evening. Eventually, this became kind of a bug tracker, and this column, known bugs, went down so far all the time. Every weekend, Jack would spend hours playing the game and just coming up with so many crazy bugs over and over again. And Escape from Tethys is a really big game. Surprisingly, I had no idea we were going to make a game this big, but it's actually, at minimum, I would say, for first playthrough, about 4 hours long. And more realistically, about 6 hours, 6 to 8 hours if you 100% it and collect all the upgrades and stuff like that. The map ended up being really big, much bigger than we thought originally. So that's mostly why. Let's see, going back to this. Let's see, what else did I want to talk about? You can see here there's a couple of things that we never got to. This was actually going to be one of the bosses that we scrapped. We thought about making it a regular enemy, but decided against it. And yeah. Okay, let's go into design. So I talked a little bit earlier about this design document that we had starting out. A huge problem to Escape from Tethys is that we, the 2 people that spent, 99% of the time working on it, did not design the base game, which is a really big problem later on when you have to fill in the gaps. In fact, very little was actually designed. We had a setting that was made. We had a couple of different areas that were decided on, a couple of bosses, but there was no story or anything like that. There was like half this document, half the first page is control scheme. Like A and D is horizontal movement. I'm not really sure why this was included, but it was. So we had very little to work with, and essentially we had to build off this base, because in the first 2 months, both me and the artist were too nice to be like, okay, I'm taking over as the designer. We were just kind of like, let's do this. Is that okay with you? Because we didn't want to offend each other, which kind of sucked because we could have saved a lot of headaches later on. Like I said originally, we had planned for about 2 weeks, and our scope kept increasing more and more and more because it was apparent that we wanted to release a good game. We decided on Steam at the end of like January or something like that, or maybe it was even like the first 2 weeks or something like that. But we wanted to do something that was worth playing and not just a throwaway, indie game that no one would care about. And we just kept adding and changing stuff. And 2 weeks became a month, that became 2 months, then 3, then 4, then 5, and then obviously 6. So a big problem as well was that everyone was disappearing, like I mentioned before. I won't talk about that again. But there was also a ton of stuff. Me as a game programmer, I'm actually professionally a web developer. So in terms of game programming, I'm definitely not well versed. Unity, I was like intermediate before this, and now I would consider myself to be probably not an expert, but definitely way better than when I started. Let's see, going back to that. Yes, the tricky code. So there's a ton of stuff that happens in a Metroidvania that you don't think about happening, that you have to code yourself, that Unity doesn't provide. There's stuff like the map. There's stuff like entering and exiting rooms and culling the rooms themselves, the ones that aren't actually active. There's stuff like music. There's all kinds of little things, and every single one of these needs to be coded. There's no libraries that a lot of people assume. Like, there's no automatic library for controlling your character. I mean, there's a couple of pre-built ones, but they're all awful and they feel terrible and they're kind of hard to modify. So a ton of stuff needs to be made from scratch. And basically the vast majority of the code in this game, other than some major systems that I bought off the asset store, like the input system, the music player and sound player, but basically everything else was written by me. So there's a ridiculous amount of work to do there in terms of design. So designing was difficult because it wasn't like we can implement a grappling hook. It was like, oh crap, do I know how to implement a grappling hook? How would I do that? I need to figure that out. How would I code that? How would we do art for that? Would it actually work in terms of the current scope that we had? Because like I said, we spent a couple of weeks already working on all the different parts, like the platforming, the bosses, the enemies, the shooting. And we had, 10% of a game designed and made already. Can we include these other things? So that was very, very difficult. I want to go backwards, actually, to one of the pillars that I tried to use, or I don't know what to call it, to actually design the upgrades in the game. So originally, I remember this one specific conversation that I had with the designer, and he was talking about we were originally going to have 1 or 2 upgrades or something like that, because it was going to be really short, game jam kind of game. And he was talking about the one upgrade being a wall hang, or a wall grapple or whatever, where you hang on the corner of a wall and then you can pull yourself up or jump, kind of like Metroid Fusion. I remember he was like a Metroid Fusion speedrunner or something like that. And I remember being like, okay, if I got that as an upgrade, that sounds super boring. I would hate that. And it was, no offense to him. But for me personally, I hate games, especially Metroidvanias, where the upgrades and the rewards act as keys. Now, when I say act as keys, I mean act solely as keys. So games like Environmental Station Alpha, where I remember you get like a blue key and a red key or something like that, and it just opens red and blue doors. I hate those upgrades. I hate upgrades that do nothing to change the game for you besides let you progress. It feels cheap. It feels like an afterthought. So for me, it was every single mandatory upgrade, every single upgrade that you get after a boss needs to change the way that you play at least a little bit. So we thought about it, or I thought about it specifically, and I started cranking out upgrades as quickly as I could. I was like, I can code these simple ones up very quickly. And spoilers, if you haven't played it, the first one was dash as an example, which lets you dash over big gaps that you couldn't get to before. And it also lets you move faster. It also feels really good to move around with, just because it lets you move faster and it's spammable and it doesn't do any damage at first anyway. But still, it's really nice to have as both a key and changes the way that you actually play. The next upgrade that we made, I think, was I actually think I implemented a double jump, and double jump is pretty self-explanatory. It lets you get higher and stuff like that. But we actually added a separate upgrade called the droid, which would light up dark areas for you as well as provide more firepower. So everything kind of has the dual purpose of being a key and changing the way that you play somehow. By the way, very early on, we were going to have a section of the game be completely pitch black. And I remember being like, how this doesn't make any sense. This is not going to be any fun. How on earth is this going to get into the game? And obviously it didn't work. So I actually kept it in. I changed it and I made it so that there were completely pitch black areas and you needed some kind of light to get through them. Someone much later on, one of our playtesters mentioned like, hey, this mechanic is really cool because it allows you to sequence break, because people could memorize exactly where to go in these dark areas and get through it very quickly, which I thought was awesome because I'm not a good enough designer to design any kind of sequence breaking. Yeah, I thought that was awesome. Okay, so let's see. Back in May, I remember there was about 50% of this map done, or maybe it was April, maybe a little bit more, maybe it was like 60%. And I remember being like, you know what, there's not enough optional stuff. There needs to be way more stuff happening. And the combat is way too samey from section to section. So what we did was we went back and we added a ridiculous amount of upgrades and a ridiculous amount of enemies. And we scattered them out throughout the world, added a bunch more rooms, and it fleshed out the game really well. I actually, man, I wish I could figure it out. I use this program that lets you draw kind of like line charts or something like that, or timelines that show you the game progress. So I had like fight first boss, then a line going to the next boss, then a line go to the next boss, and then in between I had branches of all the optional upgrades that you could get. So I spaced it out very evenly, and I wish I could show you that, but I don't remember what site it was. And I had it so that in every section of the game between every boss, there was always a couple of things that you could go and find and explore, including health and ammo upgrades were also separate, but I tried to space those out as much as possible. So it was just another tool that I used to actually smooth the game out, because at one point I remember making that chart and looking at it and being like, all the optional explorable stuff is at the very end of the game. And that sucks because that meant most of the game was linear and it wasn't quite as fun. Now, if you go and play it, it's actually much more explorable. Like you could go through this entire orange section, I think. And there's several upgrades you can get before even getting the first boss and dash and stuff like that. Anyway, so let's see, what's next? Let's talk about Unity and how it served our purposes and how it didn't serve our purposes. Unity, I have kind of a love-hate relationship with Unity. what do I want to talk about first? So first of all, Unity has this issue where they release tons and tons of cool features like tile maps, timeline, bunch of new animation stuff, and they include Cinemachine, and I can't think of anything else off the top of my head, but they do these big feature blocks every version. But then they forget about them for years, and they sort of just sit there and rot, and then they develop bugs, and they're never fixed or improved, and it sucks. It sucks so bad because so many of these are like very close to being like awesome and really usable, and some of them still work, and they're totally fine to use, but I want to talk about two of them specifically. Tile maps, first of all. Tile maps in Unity are very basic. If you've ever used Tiled, which is like a third-party tile map editor, it works really well. Tile maps in Unity are very basic. They have very little functionality compared to Tiled. They're expandable, or extendable rather, so you can program your own functions and brushes and stuff like that, and it works. I don't actually need a lot more of that extra functionality that Tiled has. The tile maps in Unity are good enough for me. The problem is that, once again, this is a pretty new feature. I think in 2017 they released it. Maybe it was November of last year. I don't remember exactly. But there are some serious issues, and the biggest one that I can think of is actually in 2018. Maybe it was 0.1 or 0.2. I don't remember. They released a completely non-beta version, and they literally broke tile maps. Like, a major version shipped, and when you would click on the tile palette, it was just completely blank. You couldn't see any tiles on there, so it made using them literally impossible. And that was so bad. I am just shocked at how automated test didn't pick that up, how QA didn't pick that up. It might just be that they have so many features built into Unity that they can't check it every version, and I understand that. But man, that blew my mind. Eventually, obviously, they fixed that, and it wasn't a big deal. I don't think I was even on that version of Unity at the time, or maybe I was. Now going back, there's still a bunch of issues with tile maps that are outstanding. And one of the biggest issues is, if I can pull it up here, let me close up this map. I don't remember if I'm supposed to do that or not. Whatever. Let me pull up a area with lava. Does this have lava? Yeah. Okay, so this is a standard room in Escape from Tethys. When you enter the room is actually enabled because it's a game. It's like a game object here. And when you exit the room is disabled. The problem with Unity is when you enable and disable tile maps, there's a bug. And that bug is any tile with animation data starts completely bugging out, and the collisions bug out and all that junk. So this is buried in documentation, but there's a method called, I think, refresh all tiles that you can call. It's an expensive function, and it sucks because I have to call it on each tile map layer, and many rooms can have 6 or 7 of them, and it definitely adds like a noticeable half-second pause or kind of freeze when you're entering these massive rooms. It sucks. I hate it. There's literally nothing I can do about it because Unity doesn't provide their source code unless you're like a enterprise user or something like that. So there was literally nothing I could do. Anyway, it's not the end of the world because it still worked. One day I remember I was working on the conveyors that are in geothermal because there were bug reports from the playtesters saying that they were just completely breaking. I probably spent about 5 hours, not this one, 5 hours debugging this, trying to make it work. Because you would exit the room and re-enter, and the conveyors would start blinking and everything would fall through them. just because the collision data would just break. It was the worst thing ever. I was just remember being like, there's no way this is the solution to call refresh all tiles every time I enable this game object. But unfortunately it was, and it is what it is. I had to deal with it. Other than that, there were small annoying tile map bugs. I remember all the time the tile palette would just disappear. I don't mean this here, but all the different tiles in this section right here would disappear, and I would have to restart Unity. What sucks about Unity is that once you have big projects, it takes a while to load. So if I had to restart it once a day, it was just kind of a pain in the ass. It wasn't that bad though, so I'm just kind of nitpicking there. Okay, let's talk about timeline in Unity, and I definitely want to talk about a couple of things about how Escape from Tethys works and all that. But first, timeline is a feature that shipped in Unity 2018, or maybe it was 27. It was probably 2017 actually. It was designed to make professional looking cutscenes. They also released it with Cinemachine, which is a camera kind of multi-camera tool, which I'm actually using. Cinemachine, by the way, is amazing. I don't think Unity made it. They bought it. It was an asset on their asset store, and they ended up buying it. One of the best assets, super easy to use. Highly recommend everyone use it. Timeline is a whole nother story. It was clearly designed to be super extendable and designed for like AAA development. But it's really bare bones. It's insanely bare bones. And I remember when I first started using it, I was like, oh yeah, cutscenes, no problem. We can have people walking up to each other and talking and whatever, and little chat boxes pop up. It could not be further from the truth. It was so difficult to include something like that it was easier to actually write line by line script these cutscenes in code, which is horrible, by the way. Never do that. And I remember looking back and being like, I cannot believe this is actually what I have to do. So Unity does not ship timeline with any sort of method of activating scripts. So for example, if you need to play some sound or something like that, and I'm using something called Master Audio, it's my sound asset. It doesn't have any sort of timeline integration. So timeline uses, I can actually pull it up here. Timeline. It has these tracks here, and if I go and add a track, you can see there's a bunch of different tracks you can add. You have to code up your own tracks every time you want to do anything. So for example, if I want to play a sound using Master Audio, I'd have to look at the Master Audio API. I'd have to create 4 different files because for some strange reason, Timeline requires 4 separate files for tracks to be added. And that would literally just give me the ability to play a sound on Master Audio. If I want to do something like stop the sound after, I have to code that functionality in myself. There is a ridiculous amount of work to do just to do something on Timeline. They eventually, I think in 2018 in the beta, this is why I went to beta, but they added in animation events that would trigger in Timeline, because previously, if you don't know what animation events are, essentially each one of these can be an animation, and then you can edit the animation and you can add specific times to call some code in an animation. So for example, if you have an animation of a player swinging a sword and you want to, at the very end of the animation, you want to, trigger something that shoots something out of your sword or something like that, like the Zelda full health sword swing, you would just add an animation event at the very end of the animation and you would call it from code and be like, okay, instantiate a sword effect here and shoot it out in that direction, whatever. Originally, Timeline didn't have that. They added it in, except it was like, it was broken. It still doesn't work right. I remember tons of errors popping up. I actually see errors popping up right now, just because Timeline tries to call that code from the editor as you look at it. As you can see, it's calling the code just as I'm moving the timeline, which is crazy to me, but whatever. So my workaround for, this is the first cutscene I made, but my workaround for later cutscenes for being able to call things in code was to have an object, just a random object that was disabled, and use an activation track to activate that object. And then in the on-enable loop, in the on-enable callback, I would run whatever code I needed to run. This generates a ton of code waste because obviously it's not, you have to write line of code for every single thing that you need to do, but it was the easiest way, and we didn't have that many cutscenes anyway, so it wasn't the end of the world. Now we're actually working on our next game, and it's going to have probably 10 times the number of cutscenes that this game had. And unfortunately, I've got to keep using timeline because, Unity doesn't have an alternative. I can't write one myself. That would take a very long time, and there's nothing else really available in the asset store as far as I can tell. So timeline is, in my opinion, for small indie games, for small content creators, for solo developers, a huge bust. Not only that, but it's got bugs with, or not necessarily bugs, but it has issues with local space and world space, which, if you didn't know, with Unity, there's a world coordinate of everything where, like, this right here is 0, 0, and then every object has local space, which is its space related to its parent object. So as an example, here I have my player who is located at -686 for this X coordinate, but it's actually the -686 of wherever the scene essentials object is, because it's the parent of the player object. And luckily the scene essentials is at 0, 0, 0, so it's identical to being 0, 0, 0 for the world. So essentially this is the world, same as the world position. Timeline itself, I remember having serious issues with it getting confused by local and world space, and it would move the player like all the way across the map every time I tried to play, when I actually hit the play button versus when I hit the like preview button here. It was just a huge mess. I spent days trying to figure timeline out and work out all the bugs and make decent looking cutscenes. And to be perfectly honest, by the end, I'm still not 100% sure how everything works, but at the very least, I'm able to make basic cutscenes now. So, okay, moving on past cutscenes, because I don't want to spend too much time complaining about that. Let's talk about how I made a lot of stuff in Unity, how I structured the game. Let's open up... I should not have clicked the save button. Whoops. Let's open up the original scene. I have no idea if it'll even work at this point anymore. So let's hit play. Let's see if that works. I'd be shocked. Oh my god, it actually works. So this was my original test scene. I can't move because a ton of stuff is missing, references and stuff like that. It doesn't matter. This was my testing scene. It's where I created like every single boss. It's where I created every single enemy. It's where I implemented, the player and all that stuff, upgrades, everything essentially was here. You can see actually a ton of the enemies are here. They're the first iteration of them. So originally this was I would say the easiest and most straightforward part. Just creating enemies, creating bosses and stuff like that. Just because it's not the more complicated aspects of Metroidvanias. That stuff, on the other hand, that stuff is super important. You want everything to feel good. You want your enemies to be interesting, bosses to be interesting, upgrades to be interesting. So it's something that you should spend a lot of time on, but it's not a deep technical issue, although I did spend a bunch of time on a lot of enemy AI. Okay, so going back to that main scene, I actually messed up and moved that scene to the wrong place. So the way that I had originally structured everything was we had created a prefab for every single one of these rooms, or sorry, I'm sorry, not every single one of these rooms, but for one room. And each room was to be, I think, 16 tiles by 32, or rather 32 tiles by 16. And if you wanted to create a bigger room, like if you wanted to do 2 by 2 of that size, then you would drag out this prefab here. Room. You have a little room here. You would duplicate it a couple times, move it up, and kind of do this. And it was a huge pain in the butt because then you'd have to go back to the tile palette. You'd have to select this and then kind of trace these edges like that. And then you had to delete these other rooms. So it really, really sucked. It was a lot of work. Eventually, later on, I created something called the... okay, you need to go away. I created something called the Room Creator, which essentially is just some code that lets me generate these rooms myself. It takes the prefab and then it places a bunch of tiles on that prefab or the tile map itself to create these rooms. So for example, if I wanted a room that was 4 by 4 and I could pick the base tile that it uses and click the build object button and bam, I have a 4 by 4 perfect size room. For a lot of the very early rooms, I had to go back and actually fix a lot of their dimensions, and I'll talk about why a little bit later. It was mostly because of map generation. But everything had to be standardized in terms of size, in terms of the number of room exits and stuff like that. So this room creator actually sped up world creation like a ridiculous amount. I was able to move much faster with this, thankfully. A big problem with how scope creep went on this project, like we said, it was going to be 2 weeks and then a month and blah, blah, blah. I never took the time to stop and work on my tooling and work on refactoring old code and stuff like that, because I was constantly like, you know, in a week, in a couple of weeks, I'll be done and I won't have to ever look at this code again, even though it's gross. And that was a huge problem later on, because going back to old code, I was just kind of like, oh my God, why did I do this? And it made a lot of things totally not possible, at least not without a bunch of work, like making enemies get knocked back. They're all not using rigid bodies. Big problem. Excuse me. So that was room creating. A room itself could be, let me drag that out again. Room. A room itself was a collection of camera bounds, or where the camera could and couldn't go. A grid, which was just tile maps. It had a bunch of tile layers. This first iteration just had like the collidable tiles, and then underneath that it was a damageable layer, or basically stuff for like lava, acid, and stuff like that. And then it had a object for room exits, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. It's how rooms are connected. And then an object for enemies, which is kind of a parent container where I'd put all the enemies. And the reason why this was necessary was when you entered a new room, you had to clone all the enemies inside this object so that you could keep the room layout consistent. So for example, if a player entered a room and killed all the enemies and all the enemies disappeared from this list, obviously that would be bad. because the next time they entered the room, you would have no reference to re-add the enemies. So what I had to do was clone the enemies every single time he entered the room. It wasn't exactly the most efficient way of doing things, but we weren't instantiating like hundreds of objects or anything like that. So it wasn't that bad. And I think the prefabs themselves for the enemies are pretty lightweight, so not too bad. The room exits themselves became a big problem because of how confusing they are, and I would love some feedback on how I can improve this system. I would love a tool, like a point-and-click tool, where I could drag room exit to connect stuff. So let's open up part of this world here. I'm going to delete this generated room that I created. So we have here one of the first volcano rooms that you go to. If I open up this one right here, and we open each of these and open the room exit objects, you can see here there is a exit on the left side of this big room. It's got a couple of things attached to it. It's got an entrance, which is just to the right of it. Which is just a totally empty game object. It's just for the position. It has a room target, which is going to be this room right here. It's just a script on this game object. And it has a target room exit, or basically when the player walks into here, send the player to the entrance of this room exit, which is on this other room over here. So walking into this room exit sends the player to this entrance right here. And I mean, you could see it happening if I, let's see, if I take the player, where's the player? And I disable, I disable that and hit play. You'll see that when I enter rooms, I'll explain exactly what's happening. The current room that I'm in will get disabled. I will get moved into this room over here to where the entrance is of the attached room exit. So I can go back and forth here. And there's a camera fade out and the player gets disabled in between. So the player is actually being teleported just very slightly to the left. If you actually look up here, you can see me being teleported slightly to reach that entrance marker. You can also see the background following the player. It moves to the position. I'll have to figure out a better way to do backgrounds next time. Right now, this is just a big mesh that the UV gets scrolled as I move. There's other backgrounds that's not possible to do with. I believe because they are only X moving, but I can't remember exactly why. Maybe it was because there's 3 layers or something like that. Let me turn this off, because it's very loud in my ears. Let's see here. Yes. So let's talk about why map exits or room exits are important. Originally, they were not standardized at all, and it was a big problem. So the way map generation works, map generation was actually an afterthought. We weren't sure if we were going to have a map or not, but after playtesting, it was kind of like, we need a map bad. So I created this map generator script, and please don't laugh, but it's pretty gross. It essentially takes this big object here and iterates through every single one of these objects and finds the main tile map for the collisions, counts the number of rooms that the room is. So for example, this is actually made up of 4 different rooms. And then based on the type of room that's set, it generates an icon. So I wish I could show you. I had a GIF of it earlier, but I don't have it anymore, of it going in slow motion. But it takes the room, it counts the number of icons, it draws that, and it finds the room exits in the room, finds what it's connected to, finds the position of the room exit in the room. So for example, this one that's here at the upper left, it'll be like it's a vertical room exit, as in it's, let me click on it and show you what I mean. It's a vertical room exit, so it's obviously going to be exiting this way. And then the horizontal ones would obviously be up, and it's in the upper left section, which means that it exits out to the left. So it knows that this room over here connects at this left side, and then it'll draw the next room, and it's recursive. So it'll continue going until eventually there's nothing left and it draws the whole thing. This took about, I would say, I don't know, 12 to 14 hours of solid work, of mashing my head against it. And then eventually when I finished most of the code, there was another like 6 hours of, okay, generate the map, and then realize that this is all off because nothing was standardized. These room exits needed to be placed at a certain part near the edge. The rooms weren't all the same sizes. So there was a lot of problems with standardization where I had to go back and change rooms and fix them and make them the right size, or move the room exits to the right place, or, you know, whatever. Actually making it so that the map was explorable was pretty sort of tricky. I had to create a map infos object on every single one of these rooms, which is a container for a map info object, a map info script. Let me find it here. So each one of these is a collider that you run into, which sends coordinates to a manager, which then enables the icon on the map if you enter it. And then obviously that gets saved whenever you save the game as an array of coordinates. So that's how, it's actually a dictionary, but that's how the map works. And this was probably the most complicated thing. I imagine in other games like Hollow Knight, the map is hand drawn and then the player is assigned a coordinate which corresponds to that map. Because I remember Hollow Knight was obviously not square based, I think anyway. I don't actually remember 100%, but it was probably less work on their end in terms of code, but a lot more work for the artists because they had to draw all that out. That would actually be a lot easier for me if someone just drew me a map and I was just like, display the player icon here. Anyway, this was a ton of work. Let's see. Animations were a huge pain to add in Unity. Every one of these art sheets need to have specific import settings, and then the sprite editor needs to be split out correctly. And then after that, you have to create a game object. You have to open the animation editor. You have to drag every one of these frames and create an animation. Then you have to go in the animator, and let's see if I have an enemy here. I'm sure I do. You have to set up the tree here properly for the animations, and then you have to go in the code and actually hook it all up and script the enemy itself. So it's a lot of work, like a lot of work per enemy just for the animations. If it actually weren't for the animations, a lot of this would be very, very easy. So kind of a shame, but you know, that's what you have to do when you're making games, I guess. Yeah. Let's see. I've already kind of talked about how we were in a rush, and I don't want to drag this video out because there's literally a million things that I could talk about. I remember thinking like 3 months ago that there were stuff that I wanted to talk about specifically around, what was it? Well, I don't remember at this point, but it was just like stuff like I was like, I really want to talk about this because it's so frustrating during the postmortem I do of this game. Unfortunately, I didn't write it down, which is probably a mistake. Let's see. I'm kind of rambling at this point, which was kind of expected. But one more thing that I wanted to talk about, which is kind of funny. At the end of the project, not at the end, maybe like in May when we really started playtesting, we noticed that a lot of people were having issues with the game's difficulty. And you started out with 10 health, and people were dying all the time. I remember showing it to a friend who was not good at platformers at all. He could not get past like the third or fourth room in the volcano, which is the very beginning of the game. And I remember changing the build, giving him 30 or 50 health or something like that, and being like, okay, here you go. And I was kind of like, you know what? I won't worry about it. It doesn't matter. We're just doing this for bugs. But at that point, he actually started having a blast. Like, he was having a ton of fun playing the game, which is exactly what I wanted to happen. So I went back and I added an easy mode. And all easy mode is that you start with 30 health instead of 10. But it made it for the people that have issues with the game, in terms of the difficulty, it made it so that they all were having a good time, and it completely solved that problem. The good news is that it doesn't take away from the people playing on normal because of the achievements. So we have achievements for beating the game on easy, normal, I think speed run. I don't think you can do speed run on easy mode. So it was like a perfect problem to like a kind of an annoying solution, because I thought I had backed myself into a corner where I had made the game too hard. But that was not the case. Okay, so I'm rambling now, and I think that I might want to do a part 2, or maybe not, of a bunch of other stuff, but I hope you enjoyed. Escape from Tethys is on Steam now. You can buy it or not. It's up to you. Yeah, it's only $5. If you like Metroidvanias, check it out. If you really, really can't afford it and you really, really, really want to play it and you just like, dying to play it, send me a message and I'll hook you up with the key. Thanks for watching.